some things work.
Thanks very much, Rushanara.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I have a couple of follow-up questions from earlier on, and then I'll go on to pensions, contributions and incentives to work. I think, Devon, you were talking about the in-crisis sort of support and that's going up and up. Do you have the figures on how, what the trend is and how much it's gone up by?
We've just published a report on it, but not immediately off the top of my head, so I'll happily send that on. I think what did come out of that report was a growing, more from the feedback from those on the front line who are dealing with the applications, a growing number of those coming from not really crisis, just a day-to-day lack of inability to make ends meet.
Yeah, but it would be really helpful if you could
figures,
give us the numbers and the
I'll
trends.
send you the report.
Yeah, thank you. Morgan, you talked about the sort of I think it was you talking about the uncertainty and volatility of payments and the impact of that. So, overall, what's the kind of macro trend in terms of that, that and how it affects participation in the labour market and so on, and what would be the way, what might be the 2 or 3 things that government could do to improve those things, that experience, to help sort of make the transition to work more smooth running? And then just one thing, which is about sanctions. If sanctions create such negatives, what's the value of sanctions?
So I can perhaps leave the macro picture to others, but in terms of the level of uncertainty in the system, the one thing that is worth saying is that universal credit seems to have more positive labour market outcomes than the preceding legacy system, so that's a benefit. When we talk to people, the thing that they obviously value their absolute level of income, but they value the security of that income just as much. And so when they are faced with a system where if they have fluctuating incomes, they are just going to be on this roller coaster ride consistently of not knowing what is going to come in next month in terms of their support. That strikes us as a big problem. I think the thing that you would do to address that is giving different types of workers more choice and flexibility about the period over which they are paid. Universal credit is very centred on the monthly assessment period. I think the future reviews of the system should look at
symptomatic
that.
of probably middle-class people being used to, there's a class prejudice almost, used to being paid in that way and not understanding the experience of people in that sort of those sorts of ways of working.
So I think there's certainly something to it being designed with a particular type of worker in mind, and therefore not as well designed for other types of workers. Just to take up your point on sanctions, I mean, I think the case clearly needs proving. I think the evidence we saw from the FOI'd reports indicates that there are questions to answer about the existing sanctions regime, and certainly we see lots of evidence of it being applied either inconsistently or wrongly for people who are coming to us.
Just wanted to add quickly in terms of sources on this. One is Andy Haldane, who's been mentioned already, and he has talked about how he thinks that insecurity of income is actually stopping people applying for higher grade jobs. Right. So he must have written about that as well. We invited him to Oxford to talk about it. And the second thing is that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation put out a call in autumn for some research to be done on income going up and down, fluctuations in income. So hopefully there will be some work on that we can see more generally than the things we've been saying in the future. On sanctions, I mean, I think one of the worries is they're increasing, or at least they've increased more recently. Obviously, they were, it wasn't quite so much an issue in the pandemic, but the person who writes about this regularly is David Webster of the University of Glasgow, and he sends regular bulletins about sanctions, and they contain a huge amount of information. There's always been some conditionality in the system. In an insurance system, it was about not throwing yourself on the fund, but there have been sanctions in a means-tested system as well, but it's that they've become increasingly punitive. I think that's what and widespread. More and more people are being treated as unemployed rather than in other conditions.
And do you have evidence, you must be aware of evidence of differential use of sanctions. We know across our society there's different levels of discrimination towards certain groups and treatments. Who are the kind of big losers in terms of differential impacts? Are there particular groups that are more heavily sanctioned versus others? Like if you've got a learning disability, or
I think there are two, probably three broad points. I think the first thing you have to look at is almost discrimination, almost from a postcode by postcode basis, based on who your work coach is, and then kind of where your kind of job centre is, and it'd be really interesting to see how that differs area by area. There could be some economic drivers for that, but probably it's more the discretionary approach. I think the second point is who's actually hit hardest. A lot of single people who seem sort of able to work, but fundamentally have some serious issues, and I don't really feel as though the support is there for them around that. That's definitely the one that stands out. We should talk about families with children, we should talk about older people, we should talk about all of these groups, but actually just single people, often single men, just living on their own with a very limited support network, are often some of the hardest hit, especially in terms of proportion of their income. I think the third point is we're talking about cliff edges, right? So you can avoid, there are certain things that can happen that mean you avoid sanctions and conditionality. The work capability assessment is one. There are others. Returning to that system whereby you face that level of conditionality, risk of sanction, is definitely seen as a risk by people. It's definitely a risk that they don't feel comfortable taking, and is in itself a cliff edge. In the same way that I said at the start, I think you mentioned sanctions themselves can be a cliff edge. Moving into work, it's not the traditional tax and benefit cliff edge, but in some ways, if you're trying to kind of support those at that end, they can be as big or bigger.
Okay, thank you. So turning to pensions contributions, the Chancellor told this committee the abolition of lifetime pensions allowances in the spring budget constituted a significant simplification of the tax system. He's also going to scrap the Office of Tax Simplification, which this committee is not happy about. Do you agree with the statement that he's made, and will it increase incentives to work? Who would like to go over? I'll start with Tom. Actually, very brief answers, because I've got a few others. Tom and Helen.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, on the specific narrow point about does getting rid of the lifetime allowance help work incentives, in certain cases, yes. I mean, particularly around highly paid older NHS staff, there's no doubt that there's an issue there, and I'm sure there are similar cases in the private sector as well. More broadly, I don't think that it's solely a work incentives policy, scrapping the lifetime allowance. I think the lifetime allowance was just a bad way of controlling pension contributions and their fiscal cost. It really doesn't make any sense at all for defined contribution pensions where you already have annual limits. It's very hard for people to predict or control how well their investments are going to do. That makes planning difficult. It applies very differently between defined benefit and defined contribution pensions, such that you basically have to have a much bigger defined contribution. Sorry, you can get hit by the lifetime allowance with effectively a much smaller defined contribution pension than you would with a DB one. So there were all sorts of reasons for getting rid of the lifetime allowance, and so I welcome it.
Okay, I mean, the Resolution Foundation would disagree with you. That they argue that it could actually enable people to retire even earlier because of the amount that they're going to
because they'd be better off.
Yeah, they'd be better off. That's right. Helen, did you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, I think there are sort of two offsetting effects. So one is, people might reach their savings goals earlier and therefore retire earlier. At the margin, they have a stronger incentive to save. There's offsetting effects. The OBR thought that, weighing those two things up, you might get like 15,000 more people in work. That's a very small effect given our labour.
And it'll cost 80,000 per person.
So I think about the lifetime, again, in principle, the lifetime cap is that it does cause problems because people can't always exactly manage how much they've got in their pension pots once you consider the investment returns. So you could change the cap to a cap on contributions rather than a cap on total amounts.
So is this policy an effective policy? I mean, it's regressive, isn't it? In terms of, with the higher, isn't it, get the amount that we're going to pay people who are high pension, who have very large pension pots, and yet there's scepticism about whether it would keep people, even doctors, in employment for longer.
Yeah.
So
I think if you're trying to do it for the pure labour supply effects, then yes, I think this is the wrong way to go about it because you're getting relatively small effects for a big change in policy. There are other problems with the lifetime cap. Say it makes it hard for people who to manage their.
Should there be some conditionality on rich people? That we're going to give 1.2 billion because we want them in work. Shouldn't we? I mean, we've been talking a lot about conditionality and sanctions on some of the poorest in society, but yet the government is quite happy to dish out, hundreds of thousands of pounds without necessarily any guarantee that they will stay in work.
Yeah. Well, I think what they could have done and should have done is cap the tax benefits. So we could have a reasonable debate. People differ on opinion on about how much you should let people save in a pension as a vehicle. I think what becomes much harder is to say that if you've already got £1 million, should we give you additional tax advantages? Now they did put a cap in place on the 25% lump sum, so that's only capped at the current lifetime allowance, so you won't be able to get more than 25% of that. That's still £250,000. That's still quite a lot of money. But the other tax benefits, including the large national insurance benefits you don't often pay in on the way in or the way out, and benefits in that pensions are free of inheritance tax entirely, remain in place. So those benefits are now going to the group who can now save more in the pension. So I think even if, as Tom said, there are genuine concerns about the lifetime allowance that are completely independent of labour supply effects, I think you do want to have something that caps the tax advantage. Now, so the simplest thing to do would be to move to a cap on contributions rather than total pots. That'd be very straightforward and would remove some of the investment uncertainty. But you could go further and do other caps to tax benefits of the variety of capping the lump sum, in which you could do very many different ways, or capping other benefits, and actually removing wholesale benefits. I don't think if we have an inheritance tax, I think pensions should be bought within that, for example.
Yep.
So I think there are a whole range of things you could do that targeted rich people having pensions, but are to do with directly the tax benefits rather than the amount of saving per se.
And just one final thing, which is about the sort of the aspects of pension tax. Which ones should be changed to increase incentives to work and save for lower income groups? Just very briefly, if you've got any thoughts on that.
So that's only one thing to be quick. I mean, one of the problems with the 25% lump sum tax free at the moment is that it is more generous to people who are higher rate taxpayers in retirement and does nothing for non-taxpayers. So you could keep something that looked like that, but reform it so that, for example, for basic rate payers, nothing changed. For high rate taxpayers, they basically got less, and for non-taxpayers, they got more. So you could reform that part of the tax benefit to sway incentives towards those who don't pay tax in retirement, who are the lower earners. That's one of many examples where you could change incentives in the pension tax system.
Thank you very much. Douglas.